I was listening to a Dharma teacher this morning. My friend David, who was a Dharma teacher up at the Ithaca Buddhist Center, was given a Dharma talk this morning. And he said something that caught my attention as a psychologist. He used the word trauma, right? And trauma is a very important concept in psychotherapy and in psychology. We often hear people talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's trauma, right? Physical trauma is like, if you have some impact on your body. Psychological trauma. But the thing that he said that caught my attention was, he said, people talk about trauma these days and about how important trauma is and how trauma is related directly to addiction. Gabor Mate is a very popular teacher and writer about treating trauma and as it relates to addiction, right? And what this Dharma teacher said today is that the things that they talk about that are traumatic, that are trauma to the person, right? So he said so that's the way trauma is understood. It's trauma to the person. You've had a traumatic experience, right? And it had a negative impact on you, and so it causes you to have flashbacks, or it causes you to have depression, it causes you to have uncontrolled anxiety and so forth, or causes you to behave strange, right, or worse, right? But what he said about trauma was interesting. He said, no, the real trauma is the trauma of being a person. That's the real trauma. And I was thinking about it the other day, and at one point I was thinking about trauma, and I thought, well, because a lot of the trauma theorists talk about early life trauma, kids that were sexually molested or physically abused or neglected and so forth and so on, right? And the reality of it is that I was thinking about this, and I used to think that the birth experience was trauma, that's, in fact, a lot of people agree with that, and they have, for a while, it was very popular, this rebirthing thing, where they would take you back to have you re-experience your birth, right, to help you heal from that trauma. But after listening to my friend speak this morning, I reconsidered that, and now my take on it is, no, birth is not traumatic. I say birth is not traumatic. Not that it's not intense, not that it's not uncomfortable, right? But there's no person there yet. You understand? There's no person there yet. So birth isn't happening to anybody. It's just happening, right? And a baby's not yet a person, right? So babies don't experience trauma because there's no body to experience trauma. There's no person there, right? And that's what he was trying to get at when he said that when you become a person, that's traumatic, right? When you learn not to be what you are, that's trauma. And if you think about it, of course it would be trauma, right? To learn to be what you're not, to take on the burden, to take on the responsibility of living life as a physical body, to take on the burden and responsibility of living life as this entity that you think of as real, right? The idea you have about who you are that you think of as real, to take that on, which takes you out of the natural state, right? And brings you into this pretense, brings you into this unreal experience, right? But you don't know any better, and so you just take it on out of your naivete. You take it on, you have no choice about it, right? And it's traumatic because once you start to become a person, then life is happening to you. Then you can be traumatized, right? Then the person can be traumatized, right? But the reality of it is, we know that the person is not an actual entity. That's part of the teaching, right? To come to the understanding that who you think you are is not real, the personality is not real, and your actual self is the awareness, right? And so by coming to that realization, then the question arises, and as a psychologist, the question arises, right? All this attention and treatment that's being directed at the person to heal the trauma, right? Well, but maybe the only thing necessary to heal the trauma is for the person to discover they're not a person. The trauma may have happened to the person, but you were never that. So it never really happened to you if you discover your true nature as awareness, right? However, and this is what kind of complicates it, right? However, the brain doesn't know that, does it? That's one of the reasons why when we talk here, we can say you can come to a recognition of your true nature. You can directly see awareness is here. It's real. It's you. You can do that. You can see that, right? But then people complain, yeah, I saw it and I actually had an experience of the relief of it all. I saw it, I actually had an experience of clarity. I saw it, I actually had this experience of being blissful and free, and but it didn't last, it didn't last. And the reality of it is it's not that it didn't last. The reality of what we are is a constant. Right? Awareness is a constant. It's always here. It does last, right? What doesn't last is you're attending to it. What doesn't last is you're identifying yourself with it. And when you identify yourself with thinking instead of being, when you identify yourself with the thinking activity instead of the being, experience of being, then you say, oh, I lost it, right? No, but you didn't lose it. You can't lose it. You are it. You can't lose it. You are it, right? There was this one kid that was born without any arms and legs, right? And he was depressed and suicidal when he was a teenager. That's when that would really be bad, right? And so his mother said to him, look, either kill yourself or stop. Either kill yourself or appreciate the fact that you're alive and start to live from that experience and with that appreciation. And he actually stopped being depressed and started to experience. And for him, it was a religious experience, right? He started to experience his value as an awake being. It didn't have anything to do with his body anymore, right? And so he went on to become a psychologist, to get married, have a normal. This is a guy with no arms and no legs. Wow. Went on to become a psychologist, got married, became a very famous public speaker.
I think you might have said something to us.
I probably did. I forget his name now. He's got videos on YouTube, right?
Very positive.
He came to Sunrise one time.
Oh yeah? Yeah. So you could ask yourself, well, how did he do it? Wasn't he traumatized? You see? How did he do it? That has to be terrible trauma to be born with no arms and no legs and to suffer through the experience of that, going to school and all that stuff, right? But see, the thing is, what I say is that the reason it was a religious experience for him was because he discovered who he was. And when he discovered who he was, the condition his body was in didn't have the same relevance anymore for him. He could experience being happy. He could experience being satisfied. He could experience being creative. He could experience being equal to the rest of humanity. Right? And out of that experience, behave in such a way where that's the way he showed up, right? And so that's why his wife was a very attractive woman, right? Yeah, so it just shows to go, right? That trauma is not something that has to continue to exist for the person as soon as the person starts to question whether they really are a person. If they're not really a person, then what they thought happened to them didn't happen to them because there's nobody there for it to happen to. Now, here's the complication. The brain doesn't know that. The brain was conditioned to believe you're a physical body and you are a personality. That's the programming running in the brain, right? So you could wake up and discover that you're not traumatized. You could discover you're not traumatized, right? But the brain will continue to play the programming that got developed in reaction to what it thought was a trauma. So the symptoms will continue to appear, you see? This is why when you come to the recognition of who you are as awareness itself, that's not the end of the show. That's the beginning of real therapy, right? Zen, now these days in Zen monasteries, they say, wake up and then grow up. wake up and then start therapy. Yeah, wake up and then grow. Wake up and then realize you got a kid's brain. Wake up and realize you got a brain that's been conditioned to believe that you're something that you're not. And it's going to keep playing that programming, right? So now it's the beginning of the therapy where you are aware of that and you can pay attention to that, right? So that you don't continue to live from there. You don't continue to live as that anymore, right? And by paying attention to that, you are reconditioning your brain. When you practice meditation, you're reconditioning your brain to discover what is actual, to discover what you can experience to be true instead of what you believe to be true, what you were conditioned to be true. So once you wake up, right, you have to begin this process of paying attention in such a way whereas the brain runs the program, and when it runs the program, the way it expresses it is in thinking. The brain expresses its programming in thinking, right? It also expresses it in emotions and physical sensations, but thinking is a primary way that people experience who they are, isn't it? Sure. Yeah, it's a primary way, right? So if you wake up, what do? You start to develop your ability to pay consistent attention to the thinking activity and to the emotional experience and to the physical experience. You start paying attention to that. You start paying attention to that in relationship to what's going on around you, right? And as you're paying attention to that and watching, right, witnessing what's going on around you, you'll see the trauma play. You'll see the trauma playing. Because what happened was when the brain had it that you were a person, it started to develop ways to protect the person, right? These are called defense mechanisms in psychology, right? Right? And so when the brain thought you were a person, it started to develop these ways of protecting the person, withdrawing, fight, flight, right, or freeze. These are all ways of protecting the personality, right? There's a whole host of defense mechanisms and aspects of this conditioning that will play. But if you're paying attention and you understand this, and just to pay attention to this is a challenge, isn't it? Yeah, because you'll keep falling into the person. You'll keep if the right thought comes up or the right emotions occur, right? Even though you know the truth, even though you've had an experience of the truth, right? You'll fall into the person. A thought will arise and you will identify with the thought. As soon as you identify with the thought, you're the person. The whole thing happens all at once. You're the person, right? And then and this is what happens, and it's more disturbing after you wake up. It's more disturbing after you wake up because you feel like you lost control. You know, the program plays, it uses your mouth, it uses your body, right, to act out, right? And then after you calm down, you look back and you say, oh man, I did it again, right? But you see, this is why you have to have compassion for yourself when you do this work. If you don't have compassion for yourself when you do this work, you cannot do this work. You can't do it because you'll be so disturbed at what you're witnessing that you'll just want to get away from the whole thing, you see. So you have to have compassion. You have to understand this will be disturbing. To start to pay attention and recognize the condition that you're existing in will be disturbing. And it's good for it to be disturbing so that you have a motivation, right, to practice whatever it's going to take and learn whatever you need to learn to get out of that mode. Yeah, because if you don't get out of that mode, your life is not going to be pretty. I don't care what you do. I don't care how much you try. I don't care how much money you make. I don't care how much power you have, right? In the end, you'll die like the rest of us. And between now and then, everything will be exactly the same as it is for the rest of us. Your life will be unpredictable, right? You will suffer old age, sickness, and death, right? As a person. You see, that's the suffering of the person, right? So the whole thing adds up to the motivation to do what you need to do to come out of that by retraining your brain. And meditation is a way to retrain your brain, right? So we say that, yes, it is the case that everything you say and do is a function of conditioning, right? You have nothing to say about it. Everything you say and do is a functioning condition. You're not in charge. You never were in charge. You will never be in charge. There is no doer, right? These are the facts. And if you're willing to entertain and consider these facts and understand the consequences of believing these facts, then you're ready to start to do the work you need to do. And the work you need to do is reconditioning. It's reconditioning, right? If you look at the teachings, what are the teachings doing? They're giving you instruction to help you look and see for yourself directly what the truth is about you. And in the beginning, that's not a pretty picture. You're going to have to watch yourself do some stupid stuff. You're going to have to watch yourself say some, ignorant things. You're going to have to watch yourself waste tremendous amount of energy, right? But that's going to motivate you, right, to do the work you need to do to come out of that and start to recognize the reality of who you are. And that reality of who you are is unconditioned. It's unconditioned, right? And the degree to the extent to which you experience yourself as that unconditioned awareness, there's a natural sense of being happy. Natural sense of being happy. There's nothing you need to do to be happy. You just are happy. There's nothing you need to do to be happy. You just are happy, yeah. Well, brain chemistry is affected by conditioning and DNA. Okay? So it's not, the brain chemistry doesn't have a life of its own, right? The chemicals in the brain do what they do in reaction to the conditioning, right? It's the conditioning that's stimulating the brain and the chemicals in the brain, right? But what you are is not physical, is not that brain, is not that conditioning, right? So when you discover your true nature and you have a sense of the possibility of being that, like you can be that awareness, right? Then you can look at the conditioning instead of be the conditioning. You can see the conditioning play instead of being the conditioning operating, right? This is similar to something that you said the other day, right? You said something about how that you spend most of your time lost in thought, or most of your time, that life comes in, and right? Yeah, but that's only because the way you're looking at it, the way you're attending to it, what you're giving your attention to is that. You're giving your attention to the conditioning playing, right? Yeah, and that's what's going to happen. Especially if you're new to being awake and aware, it's going to be conditioning, a few moments of awake, conditioning, a few moments of awake, conditioning, like that. Right? Just like it is when you meditate, right? But if you persist in this over time, right, what happens is very interesting, because instead of it being awake and then conditioning and awake and then conditioning, right, it starts to be the conditioning and the wake and the awareness start to actually integrate. It's not one changing to the other, right? They actually start to integrate in such a way where, as Rupert Spira says, that the awareness starts to populate, right? Starts to populate the brain.
It's 50 shades of gray rather than black and white.
Yeah, and so a realer way to see this is that you're infiltrating the material, right? And so by integrating, by understanding, even if you're lost in thought, but you understand that that's happening. So you're aware of it when it's happening, right? That neutralizes it, right? That makes it part of this integration process that goes on. And even now in contemporary Zen, for example, I think it's the Hollow Bone Zen community, they're actually doing shadow work as part of their meditation training, shadow work, which is psychotherapeutic, right? To discover the aspects of yourself that you're unaware of, right? That have a negative impact on you and have a negative impact on the way you function in the world, right? But as this integration occurs, right, if you can just tolerate the experience of it, right, and understand that it's a process that's going on. If you can tolerate the experience of it, if you can become aware of it, and just stay with it, keep doing the meditation, right, keep paying attention, keep waking up as much as you can during the day, right, practicing many meditations, right, eventually this integration will dissolve, right, and the natural state will exist. Now, does the natural state in existence mean that there will no longer be any conditioning? No. It doesn't mean that there will no longer be any conditioning. No. What it means is the conditioning will become less relevant. less relevant. It won't get your attention anymore. It won't be relevant anymore. It won't be something that is happening automatically anymore, right? Because you'll be a witness. You'll be aware of it. You'll be awake to it, right? And so gradually, as this natural state takes root, becomes more of the reality of what you are, that you don't have to remember yourself. You don't have to meditate to come out of the conditioned state, right? It starts to be a consistent reality that you're experiencing all the time, even when the conditioning is running. Well, see, the way I see it, mindfulness is a practice of being present. Mindful is a practice of being present, practice of paying attention, right? What I'm talking about is that you don't have to practice anything, right? That it gets to the point where I've talked about this in the past, right? There is a reality in which the personality is still on top, right? The personality is still dominating the situation, right? But as you continue to practice these practices and learn, this reality is starting to turn, right? Starting to turn. You're less being the personality, and there's more time when you're aware of not being the personality, and this keeps going as you practice meditation and deepen the experience until somewhere there's a critical mass and it flips, right? And when it flips, then the personality is still here, but it is now less than, or has less weight or power than the awareness. And when that happens, then the process continues, right? Until the distribution of awareness particles, so to speak, the distribution of awareness particles infiltrates, right, the conditioning sufficiently, right, that the conditioning is no longer relevant at all. It just becomes something that, it's more like something that plays in the background, right? But it doesn't get your attention anymore. You don't get upset anymore. The way that plays out is situations you find yourself in where you used to get upset, right? It happens and it's like nothing happens. You don't get annoyed, you don't get angry, right? And that's a process that goes on if you understand the nature of the process and how it works, right? That you are intentionally relating to situations as opportunities to practice, right? In other words, you intentionally see the people around you that you can't stand, right, as your teachers. You intentionally begin to understand that the things that occur in your life that challenge you as a person, right, that would knock you into a state of depression or knock you into a state of anxiety, uncontrolled anxiety, right? That you notice that doesn't have the power to take hold anymore. It loses its ability to take hold, right? It may come, but when you start relating to it and you see what it is, it dies out because it doesn't have any substance. It's not real. It's not real. It's just it's just a thought, right? So this whole business of understanding trauma differently, I think, is very important, right? And it can make a big difference in terms of the way people work on trauma in two ways. One, you can understand that all you have to do to get out of trauma is to know the truth. All you have to do to get out of trauma is to know what you really are rather than a person, right? But then once you're out of that, now you have a traumatized brain. So the healing process is after you know who you are and you're in awake state, right? That awakened state then can be related to the trauma in such a way, right, where it heals the trauma because it stops feeding it. It stops attending to it. It lets it wind down on its own. It stops attending to it. When you attend to the trauma and you identify with the trauma, you're back in the trauma. Do you understand? If you don't identify with the trauma and you know who you are, and when it comes up, you see it for what it is, right? You see it's just thoughts, it's just emotions, it's just physical sensations, right? And you can be present to that It doesn't have to run you, right? It doesn't have to control you. You can be aware of it. You can be present to it, right? And if you relate to it that way and you see it for what it is, it will dissipate. It will gradually lose its ability to show up at all. Just like the rest of useless negative thinking, right? Unrealistic, useless negative thinking and emotional reactions dissipate over time because you're not involved with it anymore. You stop being involved with it anymore. Why? Because you're not that person. You're not that person. So this could be a real breakthrough when it comes to dealing with trauma with people, right? And it's different from the conventional approach, because in the conventional approach, the idea is that you have to somehow revisit the trauma, right? And when you revisit the trauma, you have to re-experience it, or you have to release the energy of the trauma emotionally, and so forth and so on. It's not that type of thing won't happen, but that will happen in your everyday experience of your life, if you do it the way I'm talking about. Where the first things first, that you know that it didn't happen to you, it happened to the person you thought you were. And your brain thought you were that person, so it happened to your brain, right? But after you wake up and see things as they are, right, then you'll see how the trauma keeps showing up in your daily life, right? But you're seeing it now, and you're understanding that it is something that's left over from the past that still has residue in your brain. And you'll recognize it as that, and so you don't get involved with it, you don't identify with it, and by not getting involved and identifying with it, the energy will dissipate on its own. In the same way, when you're practicing meditation, you move attention out of the thinking activity and be aware of the body breathing, and while you're doing that, the thought activity starts to unravel and wind down on its own. So part of the practice of meditation is to calm the mind. To calm the mind. The calmer the mind is, the easier it is for you to deal with what there is to deal with as far as not getting involved, right? If it's intense emotions, it's hard not to get involved, right? But if you keep practicing these practices and meditating, and the mind starts to calm down and gets quieter, right? Then you can get more involved in actively doing what needs to get done in order to reprogram your brain and decondition yourself. Is it easy? No. Is it possible? Absolutely, right? And what's going to determine whether the possibility is realized? And this is the most important thing that I want to say. What's going to determine, what's going to determine whether the possibility gets realized, it can be said in two ways, right? In one way of saying it, it's you're going to determine, right, whether it gets realized, right? Another way of saying is to say God's going to determine whether it gets realized, right? Remember that thy will be done thing, right? So you see, when we were traumatized, what happened was your relationship, your connection to God, your connection to the source was broken. It was broken. That's traumatic, right? Yeah. And so when you come back and you reconnect with the source, right, there's a natural process that takes place that will resolve everything. To the degree to which you are reorienting yourself to reality, to the truth, to connecting yourself back to the divine source, right, everything will start to happen naturally. I read a statement the other day. It said, thinking is the enemy of the flow. You're familiar with the flow, the idea, right? Thinking is the enemy of the flow, which makes sense, right? Because you can't be in the flow if you're thinking. You cannot be in the flow if you're thinking. If a long distance runner goes into the zone, right? They're being, not thinking. They're being, not thinking. They're being, not running. They're being, not doing, right? That's what the flow is. You are no longer separate from what's happening. You are what's happening. That's what the flow is. Right? But you can't experience being what's happening if you're thinking about it, right? That's like taking a position outside of it and then reflecting on it and judging it and evaluating it, analyzing it and figuring it out. And people are very attached to that process. In fact, if you want to talk about addiction, that's the big one. The addiction for humanity is thinking. And it doesn't show up as an addiction because everybody thinks that that's all there is. Everybody thinks that thinking is all there is, right? When you practice meditation, you're discovering that thinking is not all there is. That awareness and being is something that exists that's much more powerful than the thinking activity. And so because you discover that, you want to start to experience more and more of that, because that's where the satisfaction is, that's where the freedom is, that's where the liberation exists, that's where the happiness is. And it doesn't have to be one, not the other, right? What happens is the extent to which you're experiencing that, right? That becomes the space in which your life is happening. That becomes the space in which the personality plays out. But you're not the personality. Not the personality is just the act you're playing, or the role you're playing in this game called life, like that.